Hey everyone, we wanted to share an episode that's also going out on the Diaries Plus feed today. We've been doing a series called How To. It's humorous, it's fun, it's focused on all these cool adventures, and while we usually apply it to getting rad in the mountains, today we're stretching beyond the outdoor spaces. This is all made possible. This whole show right now is being made possible by Diaries Plus members, so we are very grateful to them. It's incredible. Thank you. Please consider joining, and happy voting.
How to climb a big wall.
How to raft the Grand Canyon.
How to run the rim to rim.
How to run the rim to rim to rim.
How to.
How to be politically savvy.
How to surf pipeline.
How to.
How to camp. With kids.
How to bike pack.
How to go on a through hike.
How to ski a volcano.
How to get mail when you live in a van.
How to hike Mount Whitney.
How to race the Continental Divide Trail.
How to explore Zion Slot Canyons.
How to get a seasonal
How to
job.
run a trail
How
marathon.
to hike the PCT.
How to get a permit in the enchantments.
How to bike
How to
pack.
pick what hat to wear.
Hey everyone, Fitz here. Once again, we are heading into the scariest time of year. No, it's not Halloween and Tales of Terror. It is election season. And I'm sort of joking here, but there's a lot of anxiety out there, and there's an avalanche of information being dumped upon all of us, and it can be incredibly hard to sift through and generally a little bit overwhelming. We have a friend of the show here today, Graham Zimmerman. Graham works for Protect Our Winners and Dirt Road Organizing, two organizations that work to get out the vote. He's here today, though, just as a friend, as someone who's worked in this space for a long time, who's both a badass athlete and doing the work in the community out there. We could all use a few extra tools in our toolkit to tackle voting and how to volunteer and how to participate. And Graham knows a lot about it. So today we do How to Make Your Vote Count with Graham Zimmerman. I'm Fitz Cahall, and you're listening to the Dirtbag Diaries Plus. So, Graham, you are, amongst many things, a good human being, an alpinist who's internationally recognized for doing scary things in the mountains. But you also have had, over the last 7 or 8 years, an incredible, advocacy has been an incredible component of what you do for a living, actually. So will you just quickly tell us about your work at Protect Our Winners and Dirt Road Organizing?
I would love to. So at this point in my life, I still work as a professional mountain climber. And then I'm also on staff at Protect Our Winners, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that is working in the climate advocacy space. My role there is particularly focused on providing professional athletes and other community leaders within the outdoor rec community a pathway to build climate advocacy into what they do. And it's really predicated on this core belief that athletes in particular are this group of people who have the stories, the platforms, and the bravery needed in order to really push the needle on the climate change conversation. And it's really cool. It's something that gets me so fired up because within the context of sports more broadly, we have all these incredible examples of advocacy and athletes using their platforms to change the world. Think about Serena Williams, think about Megan Rapinoe, think about Muhammad Ali, and really being able to leverage that within the outdoor sports community is something that I'm really honored to be able to do. And I think it's important to note that my journey within the advocacy space really started with the program at POW when in about 2015, they actually came to me and said, "Hey, listen, we think you should be a climate advocate. Would you like to work with us?" And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a pro athlete who flies all over the world. I can't be a climate advocate. And they were like, actually, you can and you should, and we need you in this fight. And they walked me through that journey. They sent me on some of my first trips to DC. They sent me to the UN to go speak. They really showed me how I could leverage my stories to drive change in the world around me and really bring our community along on that journey. And I still do that. And now I help facilitate that for others as well. which is really, really lovely. And it's something that brings me a lot of optimism, a lot of joy, and it gets me really fired up about the future that we're heading towards. And then I also am board chair for an organization called Dirt Road Organizing, which is a smaller 501c4, so meaning they can do a lot more political work. And it's founded by Chloe Maxman and Kenyon Woodward. Kenyon, somebody who folks in the running space might know. He's real fast ultra runner. And the two of them are doing some really, really cool work to facilitate folks who want to run on progressive values in rural districts across the country. And they have built a strategy that they have leveraged to get Chloe into a state Senate seat and a state representative seat in Maine. And they really worked up this strategy for how they could get her into those seats in very, very traditionally right-leaning districts as a progressive. And it's all focused on meeting people where they're at. It's all focused on pushing aside the rhetoric, pushing aside the kind of normal talking points, and just going and asking people, what do you need and how can I help? And I'm here to represent you. And then leveraging these kind of core progressive values that we have of getting people what they need, particularly people who have less. And it's working. It's really cool. The organization's not huge, but they are doing a ton of work to work with candidates across the country who want to run on progressive values in rural districts. And they're like winning elections in these down ballot seats. It's pretty dang exciting stuff.
Yeah. I think today's subject matter is how do you make your vote count? And I think this is an awesome segue because I think sometimes, I live in a very, what would be considered a progressive part of the country. My representatives tend to be some of the most liberal at the federal level. But I think for a lot of us, there's a feeling sometimes that our vote doesn't matter. And what I hear you saying is that, well, in certain places, your vote can matter a lot. Right now, we're saying, how do you make your vote count, right? How do you do it? Are we doing the Lauren Delani Miller commitment scale here for this?
We can.
You want to break it down, Lauren?
I will break it down. Okay, Graham, the LDM commitment scale, TM, this is a scale that I came up with climbing in the mountains a few years ago to help me numerically evaluate objectives and with the goal of trying to keep myself from getting in over my head, which is something I have a tendency to do. And so there's 6 criteria in this list. And of course, this list was created with physical outdoor adventures in mind, but we've been finding interesting ways on this how-to series to think outside the box a little bit and use those criteria to evaluate any sort of thing that we might be psyched to do. And so if you're willing to be creative with us, we can try to adapt these things, and we'll go one by one. And I'm going to ask you to rate the difficulty of making your vote count in these 6 different criteria on a scale of 1 to 3, 3 being the hardest. And then we can kind of talk a little bit about why we think that is.
Love it.
All right. So the first thing on the list is physical requirements. So, for things that we started on the how-to series, like climbing Denali, climbing El Cap, or bikepacking the Colorado Trail, that's obviously all of those really require a high level of physical requirements. But when it comes to making your vote count, how do we think about something like that? I mean, the expression boots on the ground really comes to mind here, but I don't know if does it have to be a lot of physical requirements?
So if we're going to speak to how hard it is to vote in this country, I will say that for me, it is exceedingly easy. In Oregon State, access to voting is really straightforward. It requires registration. Vote by mail is really easy to do. There are also a lot of voting locations. And so that's for me. So voting for me is physically a very easy thing to do. But I think the thing that's really important is that there are a lot of folks in this country for whom voting is not easy or is not possible. And a lot of those folks are marginalized or underrepresented. So if we're going to talk about folks who don't have a citizenship in this country, if we're going to talk about folks who are in communities that don't have easy access to voting, where people have to wait in really long lines or travel a long ways to get to voting locations. And so when I think about my vote and why I think it's really important, it is not only because I have the ability to go cast it, and it's something that is honestly just not really that hard, but part of it is really like representing those marginalized and underrepresented groups for whom voting is not as easy. And that's something that's really important. And then when we think about how we can impact voting around the country, looking for pathways or organizations that can allow us to make voting easier for those folks, either by changing laws in those areas or by providing direct resources for folks to actually get to the polls.
Yeah, awesome. That's really interesting to think about that. For some, it is, for me, it's really easy to vote by mail too. And so thinking about how, my ballot's just going to show up at my house. I get to just fill it out and send it in, and it's really easy. And that's definitely not the case.
I have a question, not to sound like the old guy, but to sound like the old guy. Have either of you ever voted in person?
I have voted in person. My first ever time voting, I was in North Carolina, and I definitely went to a polling place.
That's a funny question, Fitz. I have never voted in person. I've always voted by mail. I mean, it's worth noting that for a long time, I was kind of in the no permanent address category, and my permanent address was my mom and dad's house. So I'd like swoop in, fill out the ballot, and then swoop out somewhere else. So no, I've never actually gone to like go into the little cubicle and fill out my my ballot. That's a funny question, huh? Maybe I should do that sometime.
I think one of the awesome parts about this is that when you do if you live in a place with mail, it's like basically the equivalent. It's like what Netflix did for movies. It's on-demand movies. Totally. It's like on-demand voting. And it is exponentially easier than it used to be, where you could literally cast your vote for anything with taking fewer steps than is required to go to the grocery store.
I think making voting easier is so important. And the other thing that I super like about that is that it allows for us to increase social currency around voting and make it less of like a private thing that we don't talk about. Like by the fact, like since the three of us are going to get mail-in ballots, that means that the three of us could sit down, make a cocktail, and pull up the League of Conservation Voters recommendations on the ballot and have a discussion and turn it into something that's not like something we don't talk about. Instead, leverage our ability to not be stuck in that little box and filling out our ballot, and instead like have a discussion around the different measures, the different candidates, provide each other space in order to have opinions and make this voting process something that is much more community oriented, which is something I really like.
So that's a 1. I'm hearing that's a 1 on the LDM scale.
Maybe a 2 if it averages out maybe to a 2 for some folks. I mean, I also think about people who have no address, whether we're talking about dirtbag climbers or we're talking about unhoused communities. There's a lot of people that make it's a little bit harder to get a mail-in ballot. Okay, and so number 2 is technical requirements. And we kind of touched on some of this when it comes to voting, but maybe we can also talk about the registering part of this. There's a lot of people, I think, that are coming into this election being like, oh, this is either the first time I'm old enough to vote, or I've moved in the last few years. I'm in a different state. I'm in a different address. Like, what are all those technical requirements that it comes with even making sure that you're going to get your ballot, or where your polling station is? Or let's talk through all of those kind of steps to make sure that before you get your ballot in the mail that you're even going to get one.
Yeah, I think that, so across different states, there is a lot of difference in terms of what it means to register to vote. In Oregon State, really low friction process, very straightforward. I think that the thing that I would recommend to folks is to look for organizations within your geography that are focused on registering people to vote and leverage the tools that they have available in order to make it as low friction as possible. And there are a lot of organizations that are focused on getting people to vote. And when it comes to the work that organizations can do, from like a nonprofit compliance perspective, it's much easier to work on registering people to vote than actually getting them to vote. So that's like, it's a place where there tends to be a lot of resourcing. And that's something I would super encourage people to look for. Like, what organizations are working on voter registration in your area, and what tools do they have that can make it as easy as possible, particularly in places where voting might be a little more tricky.
Is that as simple as just going to Google and being like, how to vote in Missouri, how to vote in Illinois?
I think that's where I'd start. I think that's really smart.
Cool.
Sweet.
What's that rated? 1, 2-ish? Probably 1?
I would give that a 2. Like, if we're talking across the nation, I'd probably give that a 2. Like, I think that takes some work for folks.
All right. Number 3. Now, this one we can, in this sense, I think we can interpret this in a few ways. It's location, location, location. And typically on our mountain adventures that we've designed this skill for, we're talking about the remoteness of something, right? El Cap, for instance, is not actually that remote. Denali, of course, by contrast, incredibly remote. And so when we're thinking about location, though, when it comes to making your vote count, I feel like there's both the aspect of some people listening here live in swing states and are in those states that are in the news all the time as feeling like their vote is exceptionally important. But at the same time, I think about the fact, I live in California, so on a federal level, the decision has kind of been made for me, but I live in a pretty red county within California. And so for me, looking towards those local elections feels even more important because it's a place where my vote can really make a difference. I'm talking about Inyo County, California, where like elections are being won and lost by like dozens or hundreds of votes often. And so, how do we think about the location of wherever we are? People listening to this are spread out all over the country. People are trying to vote that are American citizens abroad. Like, how does our location factor into our ability to make our votes count?
Yeah, that's a super important question, and one that folks agonize over is, if you're voting in Portland, Oregon, and you're focused on progressive values, then in terms of particularly like the top of the ballot races, you're going to be voting with the majority most of the time. So there are 2 ways that I think about this. One is those down ballot races and initiatives become really important. And when we think about those, they can be pretty confusing or they can be hard to gather information on. And I'll share that the best way that I've found to manage through that is to have a clear stance or a clear kind of POV on how I want the city, county, state to move forward. And then also to have organizations that publish voter guides that I trust their opinion in reference to my POV on those things. And so when I start looking at the ballot in Oregon, I have a couple of folks who I'll generally call for their opinions on specific things. But just as important, I'll look at like the League of Conservation Voters. And I do the work to see if your values align with the values of somebody like the Oregon League of Conservation Voters. And then leverage their voter guide as a tool in order to help you make those decisions. I'll share that in a few kind of key states where Protect Our Winners Action Fund, our C4 wing, is working, we're publishing voter guides in those areas in places like Montana and Southwest Colorado, just so the folks can have those tools, because those down ballot races can be pretty tricky. And particularly when it comes to like attack ads and some of the vitriol that shows up, it's pretty important to like have some trusted resources in order to reference out to.
And even in non-rural places, like I think of in Seattle, there's like the port commissioner. Like that race, I'm always like, what do I do with this one? The port commissioner. But it turns out we have one of the largest ports in America, and like what they've done in terms of like how they're thinking about their own emissions and what they're doing, how trucks idle, like all that stuff. They've gone solar, right? So it's like, even on that level, that position can have like an actual impact on some of the things a lot of us care about.
Big time. I mean, I'll tell you what, one of the most important races in Central Oregon right now is the county commissioner race. But it's, again, like it's something that you can imagine somebody going down the ballot and being like, oh, God, I don't know what to do about this. Particularly since a lot of those down ballot races are also non-affiliated in terms of a political party. So it becomes even harder because you don't have the D and the R or the I next to them. You have to kind of like actually make a decision based on what's being shared about them or what they're sharing.
It makes me think about school board races too. Maybe this is top of mind for Fitz and Becca, or even you, Graham. This is a thing that's going to really directly be impacting you and your family either now or soon. But for people without kids, I think it can be pretty easy to overlook school board races. And I feel like this is just my personal plug that like, you don't have to have kids to be on the school board. And so you don't have to have kids to care about the school board. And when you live especially in a rural community, I think you'd be surprised at how much influence the school board has on total way of life in your community. I mean, I'm sure this is true in suburban and urban places as well, but I think it's something that kind of gets overlooked often because, like you were saying, school board members don't always have outward political affiliations and things like that. And so it can often take a lot more digging and like talking to people in your community about who these people are that are running, especially when, of course, everyone's message is going to be similar. They're running to help kids and promote education and all these things. And so you're like, well, then how do I know that they're going to do it in a way that aligns with my values? And I think elections like that take a lot of extra digging compared to you might be ready to open up your ballot and vote straight ticket on a party line for whichever party you care about. But then you're going to find a lot of people to choose for whom there is no noted political affiliation. And then how do you figure out if those people's values align with yours?
Totally. And those voter guides can be super important. And I'll share that with things like school boards. And I mean, first off, the right has been very successful in like really getting in on those elections and filling those seats in ways that have made it so school board used to be kind of like a potentially nice place to work where you get to talk about education and community, and they've become pretty challenging places to do work.
Now we're banning books. It's one of those things that I think it's worth thinking about, those down ballot races, especially in smaller places. Is a lot of times that's places where people go to grind a political axe that maybe is more related towards a federal level than it is a local level.
Totally.
And it's pretty fascinating to see. And like, I think that's worth thinking about.
I think the other thing on that is that those are incubators for people who want to run for higher levels of office. Like when you talk to people about like, hey, if I wanted to run for state senate, where do I start? It's, hey, you should get involved with local committees. You should get involved with local school boards and use that as a place to learn about governance and like learn how to govern. And so thinking about those places not only as like really like critical bodies that are like making decisions about your community, but also like that is where the leaders of tomorrow are being developed. And we want them to be developing in a place that is not full of vitriol and book banning. And we also like want to make sure that the leaders that we want for tomorrow are developing in those areas.
So I don't know what number we give this, but let's just give it a 3.
I think, yeah, the down ballot stuff is hard. And I can only imagine that in some areas across the country, it gets really, really tricky.
Handful of votes make a difference in some places.
Totally.
Number 4 is this is a category that we politely call difficulty of retreat, which is really a nice way of saying, what are your bail options here? And how can I sit this out? This is really overwhelming. And it would be a lot easier to not worry about any of this and just put my earmuffs on and walk around.
I'm going to use this as a point when we can talk about how voting is the cornerstone of democracy. And as citizens of this country, it's like our responsibility. And when I think about voting and when I think about how important it is as a civic duty, and when I think about investment in the future of this country, something that was shared with me a couple of years ago that I really, really like is that the idea that we are in a country, in a democracy that is operating under a lot of stress from corporate influence, from whatever we want to call the influence of the far right. The thing that was shared with me is the way that you de-stress a democracy is by getting involved. It is a system that is predicated upon constituencies showing up and being clear about how they feel and what they need for the future. And the way that we do that at the easiest level is voting. And so anybody who tells you that your vote doesn't count, or anybody who is like drifting towards a sense of apathy around voting, just like don't bail. I need everybody who's listening to this to show up and vote. And I need you to talk to everybody that you know and make sure that they are voting as well. It's so important.
Yeah. We are 90 miles into the 100-mile race. We are 2,800 feet up the nose. Bailing is going to suck. Don't do it. I'm giving it a 3.
3 for sure. The point that we were just talking about of like you, okay, so like you're going to vote. Like the 3 of us are going to vote. Great. We have a pretty good idea who we're going to vote for. But how do you scale that? How do you resource, encourage, empower the people around you to make sure that they show up and vote? I'll share that within our like outdoor sports community, there are a lot of low propensity voters, a lot of folks who tend not to show up. And so there is a lot of work to do within our core community. And so, yeah, like how can you throw a party where everybody registers to vote or everybody votes via their mail-in ballots? How can you gather people on Zoom calls like we're going to do tonight in order to support our progressive candidate and really like drum up support? How can you be looking for organizations that you can work with that can provide people access to ballots and to polls in areas where it might be harder to get to? Like look for those other options and look for ways that you can have impact outside of just your singular vote. Like that is of course where we start, but that kind of secondary and tertiary work of empowering and enabling others to show up is also really important.
All right, we've got 2 more. The 5th one here is objective hazards. In the mountains, this is things like weather and crevasses and avalanches and rockfall. But we're talking about voting. So interpret this as you wish, Graham. How do we think about our objective hazards? Existential hazards, maybe?
Okay, so I'm gonna get at this from 2 different perspectives. One is like the risk associated with voting is low. It is a low risk activity. Now the risks of not, like we were just talking about bailing, the risks of bailing are very, very high.
All right, the last one. This is kind of our catch-all category that we called shenanigans. But it's like all of those little things, like, for instance, how you manage your waste on a big wall, how much hike-a-bike you have to do on a certain backpacking route, all those just kind of like weird niche things that you really need to know in order to be successful. It's not just, oh, you get on your bike and you ride across Colorado. It's like, no, there are these kind of like shenanigans that you're going to have to deal with. And if you have some beta for how to deal with them ahead of time, you're going to be a lot more successful. And so when we think about just like general shenanigans, I mean, we covered some of this with the fact that it's just straight up harder for some people to cast their vote, depending on where they live. But like, in addition to just getting to the polls, I mean, what are all the little shenanigans that we think of? To me, ballot initiatives is one. I feel like they're always worded in such a way that it is impossible to figure out if it's a thing that you support or not, and it's that way intentionally.
I think the shenanigans are high. I think it's a 2. There are a couple of things that I think is really important for us to talk about. And let's start with the initiative stuff. Like, I'll just go back to finding trusted resources that represent your values for your community. Whether that's a local organization or somebody who's working in local politics who has an in-depth POV on these things, building those kinds of resources I think is really important. And I think that it's also crucial to note that they tend to be repeatable. Once you do that work for an election, then every 2 years or for special elections, you can go back to those resources. Now you should always like check, but you're generally able to go back and step into those resources time and time again, which I think is just really, really important. And I think that, and once again, kind of like understanding what you stand for, what you care about, I think it's really, really important. And I'll share that like voting on those initiatives, voting on those down ballot races is just like, it's such an important part of this work. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the like imperfection within the voting process, which by what I mean by that is like none of these candidates are perfect. And voting is not just like the only thing that we do in order to drive change. It is in many ways the easiest. It is in many ways the one thing that we as citizens are like truly responsible for doing as part of our civic duty. But I had this really great conversation a few weeks ago with somebody who shared that, hey, like I have been arrested protesting under the Bush administration, under the Obama administration, and under the Trump administration. And I think they maybe hadn't under the Biden administration. I can't remember. But they were like, no matter who we vote into office, I will be there protesting and really demonstrating that, like, really demonstrating my community's need for the future that we need to move towards. I will be doing that if we vote in a Democrat. I will be doing that if we vote in a Republican. But looking at who is on the ballot, there is one of those people who is way more likely to listen than the other. And that's what they're voting for. And I really found that to be really compelling, because it really demonstrates that, like, yes, like voting is this important moment in time, but also it is just one piece of the work. It is one step in the right direction. And I think it's also crucial to note that there are two options in terms of this race. I would love it if we could be here talking about the viability of third-party candidates and how, like, that was something that, like, made sense. There are one of two people who's going to win this race: a Democrat or a Republican. That's just like how the dynamics of this work. We're not going to fix that in the next 100 days. So vote for the person that stands with your values. Continue to find ways to apply pressure to them in order to really drive those values. We're not voting for solving every problem that we have. We're not like looking for the perfect candidate. We are voting for a pathway towards the future that we collectively need. And that's what this is all about. So don't let a sense of, oh, this candidate isn't quite perfect, or there's this one thing I disagree with them on, get in the way of like showing up and voting. Because like it's like to say that it's all on the line is not hyperbole. When I think about our outdoor recreation community and why I think that we need to be a group that steps in on this work in a really big, meaningful way, it is because we are a group of people who have these incredible stories of how to do hard things. We are a group that is focused on doing things that challenge us, that push us to be stronger, better humans, to be better partners, all of that. And that requires strategy, that requires audacity, that requires bravery. And those are the things that we need to really drive this democracy forward. Those are the things that we need in order to get people to show up and vote and engage. Those baseline building blocks of skill sets and abilities are things that our community has in spades. And that is why I just find going back to this community time and time again as a well of inspiration and a well of like work to like drive these efforts forward is something that I am consistently inspired by. According to the numbers in the OIA, there are like over 170 million people in the United States who recreate outside and have that as like part of their personal identity. That's a lot of people. And if we get those people to show up and vote, we can change this country for the better. And that's something that I'm deeply invested in. Thanks for having me on. This is really fun. I super appreciate you two. You two are awesome. Being able to talk about this stuff, the way that you all ask questions, the way that you all tell stories, it is outstanding. And I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, for being here. You're always an incredible wealth of information and inspiration, and we appreciate you. There are links in the show notes to some various voting tools and resources from Protect Our Winners. Hopefully these will make voting feel a bit less like getting ensnared in some epic Type 3 debacle and more like Type 1 fun. Invite your friends and go do some democracy. I'm Fitz Cahall, and as always, thanks for tuning in.